Labor history. So, and
Probably lived through most of it, right?
yeah, yeah, I have lived through a little bit of it. It feels like it after a few times walking the picket line here.
Yeah.
You really, it brings back some. You can go back and, you know, uh, talk about walking the picket line with my dad when Paul James sent the National
Hmm.
Guard in to bust the picket line up. Wasn't that long ago, but it was right over there in Cortland, Alabama.
Right.
There's a lot of folks fighting
Yep.
the National Guard, fighting the state troopers out there on that picket line for you know for their labor rights. So
Yeah.
yeah, every time we have a strike, it brings up a lot of the past. But
Yeah.
I guess we'll jump right in and and really discuss why labor history is important, because you hear a lot of times uh, the capitalists, the working, have convinced the working class people that we don't need unions anymore. I hear it. It's amazing how much I hear out of working class people, even like people living in poverty, that I talk to on a daily basis, that say, yeah, unions was real good. They served their purpose. They got rid of child labor. They instituted the 40-hour work week. They helped bring about the Civil Rights Act. They helped bring about the Social Security Administration. They provided so many great things for us, just average, everyday working people that are not that are not going to be able to save the money for retirement, but they're not needed anymore. We
Right.
really don't need labor unions anymore. Uh, they've outsourced all the work to China, to Mexico, to a lot of the Eastern Bloc. It's the same talking points, and what capital has done has convinced the working class that it is in their best interest not to be in a union.
Yeah.
They, to our own detriment. So it's important because what people realize, and the gun rights advocates are very, very good at recognizing this. A lot of the civil rights advocates are very, very good at recognizing this. Uh, the same rights that we fought for from the beginning of time, to own and bear arms, the right to vote without a voting tax, the right, all of these rights are constantly under attack. And just as the labor rights are constantly under attack, but they've convinced us somehow that we don't need unions anymore. Everything's
Right.
great. There's no reason to push back anymore. And so, I just ask you, how many of y'all say, we don't need anybody pushing back on Second Amendment rights anymore?
Hmm.
I hear that from conservatives on a consistent basis, daily. And I 100% agree with you.
Hmm.
Don't forget that those same rights that we have fought for over generations and generations in the U.S. are still under attack every day as well.
Right.
So there's got to be somebody fighting for them.
Right. Anything good in your life has been fought for, and people have died for it, and people are going to have to fight to preserve it. These things,
Continually.
a 40-hour work week, the weekends, breaks, time off, retirement, all of that, none of that was given to workers.
Yeah.
They had to fight for it. And if we do not stay ready to fight for it and to fight for more, it'll be taken away.
Constantly. It's not just that it will be taken away. It is constantly being taken away. It's being taken away right now as we speak.
Right.
The Janus decision just a year and a half ago is a perfect example. There is a constant barrage of attacks against organized labor, and those attacks aren't just from the right. I'm just going to be
Right.
completely honest.
Yep.
Those
No,
attacks
sure.
are not just from the right. We have just as many people on the left attacking us as we do on the right. But what the right has successfully done is convince the working class that they're going to help them, and what the left has successfully done is convinced organized labor that they're going to help them. And both of us are being lied to from both sides.
Right.
You know, so we'll move on. I'll get off the diatribe there. We'll get into the history, you know, and it starts really with the founding of America. Originally, there weren't a lot of unions around. What we seen was in the pre-Civil War years, before 1870, you had some what we would refer to nowadays as guilds. There were some organization of workers, but not a lot. You've seen the organizations were very loosely, very loosely organized. They would fight to satisfy their needs, whatever that may be. It was very short-term gains, because the fact of the matter is most of the people during those times were living hand to mouth. They were living day to day. They weren't really concerned long term about retirement. They weren't concerned about health care, a lot of the things that we're concerned about today. They were just they were struggling to put food on the table every day and to make it through the winter. So, so consequently, a lot of those organizations, they never really came to fruition to be a much benefit other than just daily help for the workers, which is a great thing. But you know, as we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes, you've got to develop a long-term strategy.
Right.
So, you know, a lot of the workers that what we see, like you were talking about earlier, as far as the police state and the authoritarianism, we brought in the immigrants from Europe. We brought in immigrants from Africa, made up a bulk of the workforce. So, you know, everyone knows about slavery. If you're from the South, you know about slavery. We know what we went through with that. What a lot of people don't recognize is the indentured servitude of the Irish, the indentured servitude of the Italians. A lot of the workers that they brought over were basically slaves, even though they didn't call them slaves. But the bulk of the workforce were indentured servants, slaves, and then, of course, all the white folks. Most of the white folks were free workers. The guilds, they able to organize and join associations. The biggest thing with the guilds were they were, as they organized in the guilds were basically there. It was almost like a free market capitalism type thing. They were there to monopolize between each other and say, we're going to set the prices, we're going to set the minimum price, because you know, one horseshoe maker down the road may have been willing to make a horseshoe for a few cents less than the other one. And they were also there to structurally ensure the quality of their product. And it goes back to a lot of this pre-industrial revolution was, you've seen like the blacksmiths and people like that. They were working for themselves. There wasn't a big concern for unionism, because there, other than like the railroad industry, where we brought in a lot of the Asians and a lot of the Eastern Europeans to work on the railroad, or the agriculture industry, where you brought in a lot of the slaves to work in that industry. There really wasn't a lot of big business ownership back then. So we kind of come around into the Civil War, the years between the late 1860s and World War I, where we've seen structural growth of three significantly different national labor organizations. The first one being the Knights of Labor, were formed shortly after everybody come home from the Civil War around 1869. It was very much a business-like union, what a lot of people refer to as business unions today. They were, it was very well organized. It was a secret society. The reason that it was a secret society is because at the time, unions were outlawed. It was actually, they considered it an organized crime. So there was a lot of secret handshakes. A lot of the Knights of Labor were based loosely around other fraternal organizations like the Masons, Freemasons, and things like that.
Okay.
So the Knights of Labor, they were extremely well organized. The biggest thing was they were democratically elected as well, but they really had a top-down approach to where the workers were peasants, for lack of a better word, and they really couldn't. They looked at it as they couldn't make up their minds as to, they should not be able to make up their minds what was in their best interest. So you've seen the executive boards of the Knights of Labor putting a great deal of power on the workers, sometimes to break strikes, to prevent new strikes. But one of the big benefits of the Knights of Labor was their belief. They were anti-racial. In other words, in that time, there were a lot of your trade unions that would not accept black membership, and the Knights of Labor was very, very progressive at that time. So they accepted not only a minority labor, but they also recognized the social justice programs that they needed to start implementing. So they funded a lot of and if you go back, you see, like if you go back and look at old organized history photos, you'll see a lot of the Knights of Labor parades with the big banners, and they were real big into not just the labor portion of it, but they recognized the family portion of it and the time off. And so they done a lot of parades, they've done a lot of picnics and things like that.
Yeah, you talked about the anti-racist and the kind of social justice type of stuff that they did. I thought that was really interesting because you also mentioned their kind of elitism, and that they felt like the people in power, the executive board, kind of felt like they knew better than the rank and file folks. And so it's really interesting kind of, but because generally you associate, today at least, you associate the deep democracy traditions with the social justice movements and the anti-racist movements, and you associate the elite intelligentsia kind of, that you associate those traditions with the racist and more anti-social justice movements. And so that's interesting that they had that elite intelligentsia kind of mindset, but they also were pro social justice movements and anti-racist and stuff. I thought that was kind of an interesting note about them.
Yep. Yeah. And from my studies and from what I've learned, what I've been instructed, the early and what we're building on right here with the Knights of Labor, the AFL, the IWW, and later on the CIO, the early organizations were initially founded by one person, maybe two, and in the case of the IWW, a handful. But they founded those organizations based upon their belief system. So you see a wide variety of belief systems in different organizations. But yeah, and the one other thing that the Knights of Labor that I should probably mention is the Knights of Labor were very, I guess the word is anti-elitist in their organizing efforts. So what you saw was like with the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was organizing more around trades and crafts. The Knights of Labor did not care what trade, what craft you were. They were trying to organize industrially as well. So they were, to me, the Knights of Labor was kind of that gap. They bridged that gap between AFL and IWW. And we'll get into IWW in a minute, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You already know what I'm talking about. But so then the second one to come along was the American Federation of Labor. And the American Federation of Labor was basically, the entire founding was in opposition to the Knights of Labor. They were, there was a great deal of discontent with the Knights due to their petty distinctions of organizational boundaries between crafts, and that's kind of what we were talking about just a second ago. They really, the AFL was they wanted to draw the lines between the crafts. They were very not mad. They were unhappy with the fact that the Knights of Labor would discourage some strikes, encourage others. And the biggest thing was the AFL didn't believe in the early days, did not believe in the social justice reforms that the Knights of Labor so much pushed. The AFL was very pure and simply, their entire premise was built around trade unionism. They really enjoyed having the trades and the crafts, even though they were all brought together under one organization. They seen that an electrician, a boiler maker, what have you at the time, they were more of an elitist association. I guess. They regarded the trades higher than the other people. And they weren't as much interested in the labor movement as a whole, like unions are nowadays. And then you've got the radical group founded by Big Bill Haywood, the IWW, or the Wobblies. And whenever I originally created this, there was so much that I wanted to put in, but that I thought it did a disjustice to the IWWs to speak on a lot of the things that they originally were developed around. So I just kind of kept it brief and said, you know, the original goals of the IWW, or the industrial workers of the world, was to unite all workers into one giant union, regardless of trade, regardless of craft, regardless of what you're doing. They thought that, you know, all the workers should be banded together. And for the biggest reason was the quick destruction of capitalism. They thought that the worker should own the means of production. And it goes back hundreds of years, but that they were very opposed to the structural concept of the AFL, because the AFL didn't address a lot of the needs or wants of a large majority of the workforce in the primary industries in America. They, you know, we talked about the AFL being big on trades, and there was a lot of workers out there that weren't tradespeople. They were just general laborers. I don't know the percentage, but it was very high. And if you weren't in one of these specific trades, then you pretty much got cast aside. They didn't care about you. And the
And if
IW,
you,
go
and
ahead.
even if you, yeah, and even if you were in a specific trade, but you weren't a white male, the AFL wasn't interested in organizing you as well. And that was another, that was another thing that the IWW was founded in opposition to the AFL. Kind of, they were really big on incorporating people of color and women into their ranks and into their leadership, where the AFL was definitely opposed to.
White male. And there was a place for women, but it was a typical patriarchy.
Right.
There was some support, the early League of Women Voters and things like that, but there was never any support to actually get women's wages the same as a man's. That's for certain. Unlike in the IWW, and both of us are WAP, so we know a little bit of the history there. Needless to say, the IWW were a very radical group, and to their detriment and to their benefit, a lot of times they were called in to help out a lot of the striking workers when it was going to get violent. And so the IWW was really known for when the Pinkertons and people like that came around and started abusing the workers, then they knew that they could lean on the IWW to come in, and there was going to be a fight. And what you see is in a lot of the Wild West, what they call Wild West stories nowadays are glossed over. But the fact of the matter is the IWW was founded out west, and they fought a lot of the big government and big business capitalist issues in the West early on.
Yeah.
Especially with miners, with the gold rush and things like that was out there. They were very instrumental in those strikes. So we get through that. We get into kind of the 1930s after the war. And you've got the Congress of Industrial Organizations, what now makes up the second half of the AFL-CIO. They were the CIO. They were a separate entity at the time. The Depression after the war brought about a lot of social changes to the fabric of American society. It was very visible in how America, and when I say America, we're talking about business and politicians in general, dealt with workers and people in need. So at the time, you had all of the workers coming back from the war. Legislation was passed to allow workers the right to organize, which was tremendous because prior to that, as I said earlier, it was considered a criminal activity to organize together and try to negotiate.
And if I could just go off on a riff on that for a little bit, folks love to, especially folks who kind of deify the founders, they love to talk about freedom of speech and the First Amendment and all of that, freedom of association and how that was enshrined in our Constitution or whatever. And it's like the words were put in our Constitution, but the actual follow through did not happen until workers came together and put their bodies on the line against state and capitalist authority to make it so that they follow through. That it's such an important point that I just wanted to throw that in there, and it's basically just reiterating what we said at the beginning. Everything, including just the right to associate, which is supposedly in our Constitution, but everything up to and including just the right to associate as an organization of workers was fought for, people died for it, people were put in prison for it, people were executed for it. And, you know, we just need to remember that. And and we need to remember that it was not a liberal elite that gave us those freedoms and those rights and those, it wasn't that. It was mass movements of workers that came together to do that.
Yep. And if you go back, and there was a lot of stuff that I didn't include today because of time constraints. Nobody wants to sit here for 6 hours and listen to me drone on about labor history. But if you go back and look in the early founding, what you're talking about, there was a separation even amongst the founding fathers, with Thomas Jefferson leaning more towards a liberty side and more towards a freedom for workers, freedom for individual rights and things like that. And then you had what they call the Federalist side, which you've still got the Federalist Papers today, which is a extremely right-leaning website that believe that the majority of Americans were stupid peons and they deserve absolutely no say in how government works or how anything else works for that matter. And that's where you got your, originally your senators were not elected. If you go back and look at the history of America, they were specifically to represent the interests of business owners because they did not want democracy, pure and simple, because the majority of Americans were being screwed over.
Right.
And if they allowed democracy, then of course we would have it a little bit better than what they want.
Right.
So
yeah, we were talking about the CIO.
Yep, the CIO, and so the legislation was passed to give workers the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing under the guidelines of the Wagner Act, which we now refer to as the NLRA, or the National Labor Relations Act. Under the leadership of John L. Lewis, Philip Murray, Walter Reuther, and others, steps were taken to organize the masses of unskilled workers into the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They drew from the successes of the AFL and structural organization. They differed, however, in one crucial aspect, that they organized workers along industrial lines without regard to the occupation. So they kind of picked up where the IWW left off, even though the IWW has always been around. They've really seen a large drop off after the war, and one of the reasons that they see that drop off was because of the anti-communist sentiment after the war.
Yeah, they had the general headquarters of the IWW was raided, and all of their documents were burned at one point. At another point in history, 100 American citizens who were members of the IWW were deported because they were members of the IWW. Lots of them were jailed. Lots of them were blacklisted. It was the middle of the 20th century was a really, really dangerous time to be a left-wing radical in America. And the IWW has always been a left-wing radical union. So the AFL and the CIO, the AFL-CIO kind of survived by throwing a lot of their socialist leaders under the bus, kicking them out, expelling them, putting in anti-communist pledges in all of their stuff. And, the IWW wouldn't do that. And so they were targeted a lot more than a lot of the other unions were. And that's a big part of the decline, is that there's actual literal state violence was used to suppress and oppress the IWW and their members.
Yeah, not just their members, all union members across the board, but for certain IWW. And the CIO was kind of built out of that same radicalism, because even if you go back today, for people that have been in the labor movement for 20 or 30 years, there's still a big, you know, kind of not really a running joke, but I guess it is kind of a running joke that, you know, the AFL-CIO today, the reason that it's so weak is because of the AFL. And the CIO was more of, even, they picked up a lot where the IWW left off.
Right.
And so there was a lot of communists early on in the CIO. Up until they merged, and then, like you said, the government started really trying to crack down, because it's always been a binge and purge with the labor movement. Whenever they get too strong, the government steps in on behalf of capital and squashes a lot of the movement. So the CIO at that point became a loose organization of independent national unions. And then in 1954, the AFL and CIO merged, and this brought about the labor movement as we speak of in America. And really, the one that we recognize today is the AFL-CIO, is the organization of all the national and international unions that have a presence in the United States. So that kind of briefly brings us to today with where we're at with the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. It was patterned after the Railway Labor Act of 1926 and then amended by the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947. It is the primary legislation that governs the legal status of all organized labor and collective bargaining processes. The NLRA, or the National Labor Relations Act, sets a national policy of the concept of collective bargaining process as a way to achieve industrial harmony. And without getting off too far, you know, this is kind of where I'll throw up my hate for union political combination. There is the fact that, you know, a lot of the higher ups of the unions and then a lot of the politicians are always trying to figure out a way to quail the labor movement. There's a constant bending of the knee to the labor movement to say, what is the absolute least we can get them to make them go away? What will say, and it really speaks to what happened the last couple of weeks with the CARES Act and the stimulus package, and let's give them a little bit of money and hope that they'll shut up for the time being.
Right.
So that the NLRA governs how we collectively bargain in the United States today. So long as we operate within the rules that are governed by the National Labor Relations Board, and it's probably worth mentioning now that the National Labor Relations Board is the board that is appointed by the current administration, whoever that may be, that oversees the National Labor Relations Act. So they make decisions based on their interpretation of the act. What we have seen, and without giving too big of a gut punch to the Trump supporters out there, what we have seen since Trump has been in office is the way the board, the way the National Relations Board is appointed. The president gets to appoint the board, but it is a board, I think, of 5. It's either 5 or 7, but there's always one extra, so there's no gridlock. We'll say 5. So the president gets to appoint 3 Republicans, but he also has to appoint 2 Democrats to serve on the board. If during Obama's tenure, the president appointed 3 Democrats to the board and had to appoint 2 Republicans to the board. So it gives a little bit of sway the administration has a little bit of sway in how things are interpreted at that board, and that board determines everything to do with organized labor. All of the grievances that are pushed up to that level are determined by the National Labor Relations Board. All interpretations, any disagreements between labor and capital go to that board. Right now, do you know how many Democrats sit on the National Labor Relations Board?
I guess 2, right?
You would think so. But do you know how many actually sit on the board?
No, I can't say I do. How many?
Zero.
How is that?
He has refused to appoint any opposition to the board. So you have 3 Republicans sitting on the board and 2 empty seats for the last 3 years, almost 4 years.
I didn't even know. That's insane.
And
that's crazy because you said something about how the president has a little bit of sway over that, and it's like he has total sway because you can pick. You can go down south and pick an old blue dog Democrat who hates organized labor appoint them to the board, presumably. Like it wouldn't be. Surely it wouldn't be that hard to just find some Democrat who agrees with you on labor issues and appoint them to the board. But he won't even do that. That's insane. That's wild. I had no idea.
And so, that kind of bears saying here is why you hate to have politics involved with organized labor. It's absolute. I hate it worse than anything in the world, but it's also that kind of speaks to the reason why it's so important to be intermingled with politics, because unfortunately everything we do in the United States is, the regulations, the laws are set through the legislative process. So most people don't recognize that all of the pro-Trump, pro-American worker sentiment that he likes to speak. Whenever you tell them that, they shut up real quick because they recognize that that's probably one of the worst things that you can do to organize labor is not appoint the 2 dissenting opinions. Even though as well as I do, if you got 2 dissenting opinions, it's just like the Supreme Court. You're not going to get anything through. But at least you have a voice of reason there, and they've absolutely refused to even provide the dissenting voice of reason.
Well, and that's like the I think that liberals especially, I don't think leftists really have this illusion as much, but like liberals have got to kind of demystify government institutions like the National Labor Relations Board or like the Supreme Court, because all they are is another field on which to contest and exercise power.
Yep, it's a battleground.
It's a battleground. It is not, I don't care what the constitutionalists or the originalists say they're doing. They're molding the words on the paper to whatever their ideological biases say that it should say. No one interprets the law neutrally. That's not something that happens. And so, they need to John Roberts and a lot of Democrats say things like, oh, there are no Republican judges on the Supreme Court and there are no Democratic judges on the Supreme Court. And that's just a bunch of BS. That is a load of garbage, and you've got to get that out of your mind, demystify these institutions. They're not special. They're not lofty. These are not the 9 most intelligent, most qualified people in America. They are 9 people that were appointed by other people to contest and exercise power for their constituents. And we need to decide who their constituents are going to be. and it should be us. We should make sure that the people that are on the Supreme Court are representing the interests of working people and not the owner class, the ruling class. And that's I just when you talked about that, that made me think of the way that the Supreme Court and all and these government institutions are kind of mystified, and it just really upsets me because it's so blatantly political. Need to wake up.
Yeah, and we talked about it on the last meeting, and I'll just bring it up here again because it's worth saying that although we recognize that Democrats has been more in favor of organized labor than the Republicans, nobody's really helped us throughout history, with the exception of one or two. So, yeah, it is a political effort, but the fact of the matter is boots on the ground matters more than any
Right.
politician in office will ever matter. But I say that with the caveat that politicians in office have everything to do with our liberties that we appreciate today, or that we
Right.
may not appreciate today.
And boots on the ground to influence politicians too.
Well, you'd like to think so, but and they have to some extent, but unfortunately, it takes a large majority of boots on the ground to influence politicians. It takes a whole lot less boots on the ground to influence capital, because capital reacts a whole lot quicker than politicians do.
Right. You just watched a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We're in North Alabama talking about the news for workers, by workers. We're going to be on the radio on 92.5 FM, 770 AM in the Huntsville, Decatur, Athens listening area on Saturdays from 9:30 to 11 a.m. beginning in May. We believe that this is a really good opportunity to put new ideas in front of a conservative talk show audience. This is an audience that has never so much as heard the word union in a positive light. But we need help raising the funds to purchase the airtime. So if you could afford to send us a few bucks, you can do that by going to patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. If you can't afford to do that, that's fine too. There are a lot of people going through some really rough times right now. So if you could just share our videos, that would be really helpful. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.